What is the most obvious thing that happens when you start to get people back into the same building, into the same room? What happens when people start to reconnect in person? And you're guaranteed it's going to happen. And this is the perfect message to follow, just came out of Valentine's Day, and, there's romance is in the air and love is in the air. And so this is the most obvious message coming out of romance and love and reconnecting. And when people start to get back together, what are you guaranteed is going to happen? I know you might be thinking that I'm going to talk about weddings and marriage or maybe parenting. No. Conflict. You know what you're guaranteed is going to happen? There's going to be issues in relationships. It is as inevitable as taxes and death. When people reconnect in person, when you couldn't be together for a family meal, you couldn't gather for a holiday during the shutdowns, and then people start getting back together, you're guaranteed there's going to be conflict. And so, if you've only learned how to deal with conflict since the pandemic, maybe in the last couple of years, what are you being taught is the right way to deal with conflict? When you have a problem with somebody, how is the culture around you teaching you to deal with conflict? Well, I'll give it to you. You cancel them. You make sure that their voice is shut down. That it's not just that you can disagree, it's that you destroy them. It's that you cancel them so their voice can't be heard by anyone. We cancel them. We destroy them. It's not enough to debate with them or disagree with them. I want them gone, right? And then even if I can't cancel them, I get together in my own echo chamber, meaning with people that agree with me, and we just bash them. We destroy their character. We insult them. We use sarcasm and whatever other tools and weapons we have that are often very passive aggressive, meaning to their face or even with them, they might think that we're being kind or gracious, but behind their back, we're just ripping their reputation and destroying their character. And the obvious question is like, how is that working for us? Because I think most of us have discovered how many tough guys there are behind the steering wheel of their car and behind their keyboard. It seems like everyone's a tough guy when they're in their car or when they're on their computer or on their device, right? But the moment you meet people face to face and conflict becomes personal, the skills or the methods and tools we use online don't necessarily translate into real life and interpersonal relationships. I mean, on Zoom, you could just turn it off. You can just not read a text. You can just end the FaceTime conversation. And so what are we learning about how to bring that into real relationships? Here's what I also know that we're learning in our culture. That I can do whatever I feel. I can say whatever I think with impunity, meaning without any consequence. And I can believe whatever I want to believe, even if it contradicts reality or if it contradicts the truth of the situation, because it's my truth, and my truth can be entirely different from your truth. Now, in the real world, in a world of facts and actual truth, you can't have two opposing truths. But in 2023, you can believe what you want to believe. You can do whatever you feel. You can think what you want to think, and you can have your truth, which is different than my truth. And so, you might just think I'm ranting about culture. I'm not. I'm actually driving to the issue about how we deal with conflict, because here's what we do. I don't have to deal with conflict. You're wrong, I'm right, and I can cancel you when I want to. I can just unfriend you, unfollow you, just delete you out of my life, and maybe out of reality around me. You no longer exist. And so we're teaching an entire culture of young people, and we're being taught that I can do what I want, say what I want, think what I want to think, believe what I want to believe, and that there are no consequences, meaning I don't have to have self-control. We're basically removing impulse control from our conflict. You don't have to control yourself. And when you don't have to control yourself, and we don't value life, then we have no problem destroying people. Especially if you don't have to see them when you destroy them, because you're just deleting them online, right? I mean, I don't think ever before has there been a culture, right? Because you think about how much of our interactions are on social media. And so on social media, you can just unfollow someone, unfriend someone, delete someone, or report them, right? This is the whole idea of canceling. And so we've never made it easier to file a false report. I mean, you can literally report anyone for anything, and it's someone else's problem to investigate whether what you reported is true. Maybe you've been reported, and then you had to defend yourself, and you're like, you have no idea who reported you. You don't have any idea what they said. And so what I'm getting at is we have a culture, a generation, learning how to deal with conflict, but yet it's not the right way. And so let me lean in, because I want to set this up, because the reality is every one of us have been hurt. Every one of us have been offended. Every one of us have been wronged. And when you're wronged, you want to get even. But not just even, you want to get back. So you're willing to destroy and devastate. Years ago, when I first got the privilege of the opportunity to go to the nation of Albania in the Balkans, which is right near Greece, and the Balkans includes Kosovo, Montenegro, Macedonia. So we went to Albania on a mission trip to do some humanitarian work with doctors and just meeting needs in an incredibly impoverished portion of the nation in northern Albania and Shkodra. And when we got there, I slowly began to learn more about their culture, where they have what's called blood feuds. Now, a blood feud comes from this, right? So someone gets murdered, which was unfortunately and is not all that uncommon. And in a blood feud, what happens is when a family member gets killed, the family wants revenge. And they don't really care who dies, whether it's the person that murdered or anybody else in the family. So the entire family goes after the family of the murderer. So whether they kill the murderer or anybody else, that's how the blood feud plays out. So the entire family of the person who was the murderer goes into hiding. Now, the idea here is that they're forced then to expose the murderer and there's justice, right? But sometimes they go into hiding. And so the entire family is locked down. Now, if the murder happens where it's a blow to the head or a shot to the head, then two people died, not just the murderer, but they want somebody else in the family. And so when I was there, I learned, I met a young pastor who was basically taking care of the church on behalf of the senior pastor, because the senior pastor and his entire family were in hiding. They couldn't go out of their home. And so this young man and his wife were having to run the whole church for the senior pastor. And I was just shocked by this reality that, even a pastor would have to go into hiding. Years later, I had gone back several times. And one year when I went back, I learned that that pastor had actually been murdered by someone in the family that was in the blood feud. He had come out of his home and they gunned him down. And the blood feud ended. And that's the mentality, is like, we want blood, we want revenge, we want payback. And so Jesus is talking about this, and he says, this is not the way it's supposed to be. And a culture that Jesus is speaking to is very similar to this mindset in Albania, right? A culture of honor versus shame. And so the whole family gathering into the offense, defending their own reputation, sticking up for their honor. You've shamed us and we're going to get you back. And so it pulls an entire village in against someone. And so Jesus, when he's teaching about this, let me again set up the stage for it. We're looking at Matthew chapter 18, where Jesus is going through a series of stories teaching about the value of life. That God cares about life. God cares about your life, that your life is precious. And he goes on to talk about how valuable people's souls are to God. And then, and what he tries to do next is he's showing not only are people valuable to God, but God wants you to value other people's lives. So this is what it says, right? Matthew chapter 18, verse 15 says, if your brother sins against you. So Jesus is talking not just about like if somebody offends you, if someone hurts your feelings, if, like sin would be that this is something that God says is wrong. And the community at large agrees this was wrong. So you were wrongly treated. Someone violated you by breaking the law. And everyone agrees what was done to you is wrong. So he says, a brother or sister sins against you. What do you do when this happens? Well, let me start by saying what you don't do. And I could just go back to what I already shared and kind of go through the list. Don't cancel, don't destroy, don't delete, don't unfriend, But let's take it a little further than that. Let me give you a list of don'ts. Here are some things to avoid when it comes to the reality of conflict in real relationships, in person. But this should translate to how we treat people online. Don't be condescending. You don't use your words to cut people down and insult them. Don't be a keyboard warrior. Being a tough guy online, just being willing to insult and tear down, and then don't bring that into your interpersonal relationships. Don't deflect or distract, meaning don't just try to avoid the conflict. Don't be rude. Don't be quick-tempered. Don't fly off the handle quickly and lose control and get angry about things that, frankly, you need to keep your cool. Here's another good one. Don't pick sides in others' arguments. Don't stick your nose in the middle of it and get involved in things that we shouldn't be getting involved in. And here's some more. Don't hold grudges. Don't just keep carrying an offense around. How about don't drudge up the past? If something is settled, leave it in the past. Don't be easily offended. Don't react before finding out what's really going on. So not just not overreacting, but oftentimes we react to a small amount of information and then we get dragged into things that, frankly, if we had more information, if we had learned a little more, we would think very differently about the situation. So slow down, learn. Don't argue with people who like to argue. There's a popular saying, don't wrestle with a pig. You'll both get dirty, but only the pig will enjoy it. Right? Unfortunately, there's people that just like to argue, and when you get into it with them, both of you get hurt, both of you get riled up, both of you get emotionally entangled, but meanwhile, they're actually enjoying it. Okay, so what is the way we should be handling conflict? Well, let me just read the passage to you. So he says, if your brother sins against you, what do? You go and point out their fault just between the two of you. If they listen to you, you have won them over. But if they will not listen, take one or two others along, so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. If they still refuse to listen, tell it to the church. And if they refuse to listen, even to the church, treat them as you would a pagan or a tax collector. Truly I tell you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Again, truly I tell you that if 2 of you on earth agree about anything they ask for, it will be done for them by the Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 gather in my name, there I am with them. So he's talking about how even when you pray, God is present. So be careful that you're not bringing offenses and fights into your relationship with God. Let's make things right. In fact, that's my key challenge to you, is this. You won't always get it right, but always make it right. Now, in relationships, in your home, in your marriage, with your kids, in friendships, here's maybe a saying you can adopt. We won't always get it right, but we will always make it right. Making it right is the idea of reconciliation. Now, I gotta be just really honest with you. I actually came up with that line, that big idea, because of some disagreement in my own home. And I actually sat down at the dining room table recently and I said, look, we don't always get it right, but we will always make it right. And then I thought, as I was writing this sermon, I thought, oh my goodness, that was perfect. That's literally what Jesus is saying here. You're not always going to get it right. There's going to be offenses. There's going to be conflict, but you always make it right. Now let me show you how to make it right. And you know what you and I have noticed? Things are not right in our relationships because things are not right in us. The truth is, sometimes we get angry and we get hot-tempered and we react the right way at others because we're angry with ourselves. Usually when you're covering things up inside, it comes out at others. When you're harboring secret shame or guilt or there's hurt inside, you take it out on others. A statement I've made many, many times, and hopefully you've learned it and you've repeated it if you've been around Lifehouse long enough, is hurting people hurt people. Another way of saying it is what fills spills, right? What fills spills. And so hurting people hurt people. But here's the thing. You think the issue is just a blood feud you're having with somebody else? And oh, by the way, we all have blood feuds because we all want blood. We just do it differently, right? Maybe you and your friends and your family aren't hunting people down, but we're willing to kill them with silence, imprison them with avoidance, chain them with regrets and shame and guilt. We're willing to destroy people's reputations. We spread rumors and lies. Oh, we want blood. But you know what the reality is? Our blood feuds come from a spiritual blood feud between us and God. We wronged God. And because we were cut off from a relationship with God as a result of a blood feud that comes from our sin, we wronged God. And this sin that's in our spirit infects and affects relationship with God, cuts us off from God. And so now there's a blood feud between us and God, and in our spirit, we feel it. We know there's something wrong, and so we go into hiding. We avoid, we distance ourselves from God. Only God isn't hunting us. No, the reality is that this sin that produces a blood feud between us and God and separates us from God leaves us in a life of sin, hiding, doing wrong, headed toward a forever without God. I mean, you don't want to live in the same home with somebody you're in a blood feud with, and so why would we want to go to heaven if we're against God? And so we go into a place that is without God, an eternity of judgment, but God. God, in this blood feud with us and all mankind, rather than coming to destroy us, he comes to end the blood feud. So you know what God does? Someone must die. So God steps from heaven to earth. He becomes part of our family. He acknowledges someone must die. And this someone must be a perfect sacrifice. And so Jesus gives his life to end the blood feud between us and God as a payment for sin. And so he died in our place, taking on our shame, our guilt, our sin, judgment. But Jesus not only died, he rose from the dead. And this is where the story takes a radical shift, even from what you would experience in a place like Albania. Because when Jesus rose from the dead, as part of our family, he invites us into the family of God. Only through faith in Jesus do the sons of man have an opportunity to become the sons of God. Jesus invites us to become part of his family. When you believe in Jesus by faith, that he died for you, that he rose from the dead, and you put your full faith in him, he welcomes you into the family of God. And something that never happens in Albania when a blood feud ends is they don't get together and have a big barbecue. It just ends, like justice has been served. There's still hate, there's still hurt. It's just over. But the relationship between us and God, the blood feud doesn't just end. We're reconciled. There's peace between us and God. There's relationship now between us and God. We're invited into a reconciled relationship because of the sacrifice of Jesus and the resurrection of Jesus. Now we have new life relationship with God. And that's what you and I are invited to. And so, hey, before I say anything more about conflict and conflict resolution, let me just pause and say you will never, and I will never get this right with others unless it's right between us and God. Unless this blood feud is ended, we'll never get relational blood feuds right. If that's where you're at right now, you want to get things right between you and God, can I encourage you to pause? Pray. God isn't after you to destroy you. He's after you to rescue you from the blood feud. And he already paid the price. Jesus already died and rose for you. And all you can do is believe in him by faith. And if you're saying yes to Jesus, would you let us know? We would love to celebrate that. We would love to say, welcome home. Welcome to the family of God. You now have a dual citizenship. You're part of two families. You live in this family in the world, and you're part of the family of God, and we want to welcome you home. If you're making that decision, would you let us know? Scan the QR code that's on the screen. When you fill out that form, one of our pastors is going to follow up with you to encourage you, to say welcome home, to give you some tools as you begin this new relationship with God. Here's what I know, that what fills spills. That when the blood feud between us and God ends and we are forgiven and transformed in relationship, it begins to change how we have conflict. And so I don't want you pointing at others, telling them they have to do it different. I am saying that you and I do conflict different because God took on our punishment. Jesus took the blow for us, and so it changes how we have conflict with others. If you believe in Jesus by faith, you should not be handling arguments the way the rest of the world does arguments. You should not handle conflict the way the rest of the world handles conflict. It doesn't matter if you just made a decision today. Jesus radically changes how you deal with conflict and arguments and disagreements. So let's jump back in and let's learn some things from Jesus' teaching in this passage in Matthew chapter 18. Verse 15, it reads, if your brother or sister sins against you, go and point out their fault just between the two of you. Why? If they listen to you, you have won them over. And so there is this picture of don't wait, initiate. You like that? Don't wait, initiate. Which means reconciliation is proactive. What did God do? Was God waiting for us to grovel? We were never going to make it right with God. And so God pursued. God did not wait, he initiated, right? Don't wait, initiate. That means someone has to make the first move. When you believe in Jesus by faith, it is always on you to make the first move. Well, they wronged me. They should come to me. They owe me an apology. Good. Don't wait. Initiate. Jesus, in his great Sermon on the Mount, recorded in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5, verse 23, Jesus is teaching and preaching, and he says this, therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar, you're in a moment of worship. You're being generous to God. And there you remember that your brother or sister has something against you. Leave your gift there in front of the altar. First, go and be reconciled to them. Then come and offer your gift. He said, this will affect your relationship with God. You're in a moment of worship. We're singing songs. And you remember in this process, boy, that person feels like I wronged them. He said, drop everything, go, be reconciled, and then come back, and God will receive your gift, your worship, your expression of love. Why? Because you can't say, I love God, if you're not being loving to others. And so the key here is someone has to make the first move. Reconciliation means you make the first move. You're not always going to get it right, but you always make it right. The only way you can make it right is if you make the first move. Now, when you make the first move, you're not throwing the first punch. All right? So here's another little phrase I want to give you. I thought I would come up with some meaningful phrases for you that hopefully you can use. By the way, I'm hoping that you're typing this, you're writing this down, you're making some notes here, because sometimes when we write things down, we're more likely to remember them, and you have a reference point. You can go back and say, man, I remember Pastor Patrick said that, and I can find those notes. Here's the key note that I want you to make now. it's unfair not to fight. It's unfair not to fight, but fight fair. It's unfair not to fight. Meaning you've got to work things out. You got to go. You have to make the first move. It's unfair to just let it sit. Here's why. Because tension and conflict never resolve themselves. They metastasize and spread. And the more they spread, the more people get involved, the more destructive it becomes, the more people are hurt. And so if you don't want it to metastasize and destroy, you got to deal with it and deal with it quickly. So it's unfair not to fight, but you got to fight fair. So how do you fight fair? Basically, the opposite of the list I gave you of don'ts is what you do. Rather than being condescending, be kind. Speak thoughtfully, right? Speak words of life rather than death. Rather than being rude, be gracious. Give the benefit of the doubt rather than assuming the worst. Rather than getting involved with other people's arguments, leave space for privacy. Don't meddle in other people's affairs. And if somebody's trying to suck you in to their issues, coach them and counsel them in the right way, the godly way of conflict, but don't you get trapped, right? We have to initiate, which means we have to fight, but we got to fight fair. If you think about other ways that that we don't do these things, don't delete, don't cancel, don't destroy people. Look out for them even while you're trying to make things right, so protect privacy. That means when you have an issue with somebody, you go right to them. You're trying to work it out with them rather than sucking other people in. Don't build unhealthy alliances. Don't pull your kids into a marriage conflict. Don't get others triangulated into your unhealthy issues. One of the verses, chapter 18, verse 15, right off the bat, he says, if your brother sins against you, go and show them their fault. You know what the point of that is? Go right to them and say, hey, here's what you did wrong. Or if you remember that somebody has a problem with you, go right to them and call it what it is. Meaning, don't make a mountain out of a molehill. Don't drudge up the past, right? Stick to the issue. Keep your focus. Deal with the issues at hand. Because when you deal with what's right in front of you, you can stay focused. You can keep the issue small enough that you can resolve it and reconcile the relationship. Jesus continued and he said this, but if they will not listen to you, take one or two others along so that every matter may be established by the testimony of two or three witnesses. So Jesus is saying, yeah, just get other people involved like a blood feud. No. He's saying, go, get counsel, get coaching from godly adults who can testify to where there is wrong. Jesus is not saying make a mountain out of a molehill, get a bunch of alliances, drag people in. I would challenge you at this. If you can't work it out with somebody, you can't work it out in your marriage, you can't work it out in your home, you can't work it out with a coworker, go to someone that you trust, a godly individual, and say, hey, coach me. Is there a better way I can do this? And if that doesn't work, you go to somebody with authority to intervene and say, hey, I'm not asking you to take sides. I am saying I've tried to work it out and it's not working out. Would you help me in reconciliation? And if you get invited into that, you need to fact check that they've taken the proper steps. And when you step in, you are only stepping in as a godly voice to bring reconciliation, healing in relationship. If you go down just a few verses, the story is directly tied. It says, then Peter came to Jesus and asked, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times? And Jesus answers, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times, or another translation says 70 times 7. The rabbis, teachers of the law, would say you need to forgive someone 3 times, which means like if they've wronged you, you forgive them. It's almost like 3 strikes, you're out. So Peter thought he was being very generous. Jesus, are you saying that we should forgive somebody? More than twice that, like 7 times. It's the number of perfection. Jesus goes, 7 times? No. How about 70 times 7? And if you're doing the math, you missed the point. Because the key is this. Same person, same issue. You keep forgiving them over and over and over again. And sometimes It's not just that they're wronging you over and over and over again. It's that you're replaying the offense in your mind over and over. And sometimes you got to forgive them in your heart over and over and over for the same offense. And the key here is this: forgiving is reconciling. You're not always going to get it right, but you always make it right. The way you make it right is forgiving. The opposite of forgiving is holding on, demanding repayment, wanting people canceled, wanting them hurt, wanting them destroyed, holding on to the right to bring it back up and remind them that they owe you. Who are you holding debt against? It's time to cancel those debts. So Jesus goes on and he tells a story about a man who owed such an impossible debt that if he had worked a 1,000 lifetimes, he would never pay it back. And he owed it to the king who has all authority in that kingdom. And so the king is demanding repayment. And the man throws himself at the king and he says, I'll work for this. I'll work. Just give me time. The king is fully aware that no matter how much time he gives him, or even if he put his entire family into a prison camp where you would pay off your debt over time, like a labor camp in those times, he knew that if he put his whole family in, they would never pay off the debt. And so you know what the king does? In compassion, the king forgives him the debt. So Jesus continues to tell the story. By the way, doesn't that remind you of someone? Oh, that's right, you and me. We have a debt of sin that no matter if we lived 1,000 lifetimes, we would never pay for it. So the king paid our debt in full with his own life. But this man left the throne room of the king, and he remembered that he had a friend that owed him like $20. And so he goes to him, and it says that he begins to beat him and demand repayment. The man says, I don't have it. He says, no, I want him thrown in the work camp, in the labor camp until it's paid. People around heard what was happening. They went back to the king and said, hey, that man that you just forgave that huge debt, he's beating up a friend up here and throwing him in prison. King calls the man back into his court and says, what are you doing? Shouldn't you have forgiven him such a small debt when I forgave you so much? And Jesus makes this key point. Matthew chapter 18, verse 33 and through 35 says this: shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you? In anger, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all he owed. This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart. What's Jesus getting at? He's saying, what fills spills. You have not received forgiveness if you're demanding repayment. And when you haven't received forgiveness, you're living in a great debt to God, and you're going to have to pay that debt in full. When you're forgiven, you forgive. When you're loved, you love. What fills spills. You won't always get it right, but we always make it right. Christians aren't perfect. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to sin. We're going to wrong each other. We're going to wrong others. We're not going to get it right every time, but we always make it right. And you know how we make it right? Through Jesus. We can't do this on our own. He reconciled the blood feud between us and God. And really the way I want this to conclude is by you taking some time to pause. Think about how you can receive God's love so you can give God's love, how you can be forgiven so you can forgive, how you can be reconciled again so you can reconcile. Can I encourage you? In just a few moments, we're going to take communion together. But before we take communion, I want you to take some time to pause, pray. When we take communion, what we're doing is we're remembering Jesus' broken body to end the blood feud. The cup is a remembrance of his spilled blood that doesn't just end the blood feud, but brings forgiveness and reconciliation between us and God. So every time you eat the bread and you drink the cup, you're remembering what Jesus did on our behalf to not only end the blood feud, but reconcile relationship. So I want you to think about that as you hold that cup and you hold that wafer. This is what Jesus did for me. If you need someone to pray with you, we have a prayer team available in each of our campuses. Ask someone for prayer. Maybe there's a conflict and you want somebody to pray with you about resolving that conflict. Can I encourage you as we go into this song, would you take this opportunity to make sure your heart is right with God? And as you're singing, maybe there are people that God is going to bring to your attention that you need to make things right in relationship with. Would you take time right now to get your heart ready to take this meal of communion together?